Echoes of the Past. Chapter 1. The Discovery. Detective Alex Hartman had seen his share of strange cases, but nothing quite like this. The dimly lit basement of the old courthouse, where cold cases went to die, was rarely visited by anyone other than him. It was a graveyard of unsolved mysteries, and it was here that he often sought solace when the pressure of active cases became too much. This time, however, something unusual had drawn him back to these dusty files. The air was thick with the scent of mildew, and the flickering overhead light did little to chase away the creeping shadows. Alex sifted through the worn-out folders, his fingers brushing against the rough edges of paper that had yellowed with age. He was looking for something, though he wasn't sure what. His instincts told him that the answer to the nagging feeling at the back of his mind lay somewhere among these forgotten records. He paused as a particular file caught his eye. The name on the tab was barely legible, but he could make out the date, 20 years ago. Pulling the file from the drawer, he opened it and began reading the contents. The case involved a string of brutal murders, each victim found in similar circumstances, tied to a chair, their throats slit, and a single white rose left on their laps. As he read further, a chill ran down his spine. The details were eerily familiar. Too familiar. Just last week, he had been called to a crime scene where a young woman had been found murdered in the exact same way. A white rose on her lap, her throat slit with surgical precision. At the time, he had chalked it up to coincidence, but now, seeing the exact same details in a case from 2 decades ago, he couldn't shake the feeling that something much more sinister was at play. He closed the file and leaned back in his chair, the implications of what he had just uncovered sinking in. If this was the work of the same killer, how could they have remained undetected for so long? And why had they started again after all these years? More importantly, how many more lives would be lost before he could stop them? Alex knew he couldn't keep this to himself. He needed to bring in his partner, Detective Sarah Lawson. She was sharp, intuitive, and, most importantly, someone he could trust completely. They had worked together for years, and though their personalities sometimes clashed, their partnership had solved some of the most challenging cases the city had seen. He grabbed the file and headed for the door, his mind racing with possibilities. Whoever was behind these murders had stayed hidden for 2 decades, and now they were back. Alex couldn't shake the feeling that the past was about to collide with the present in ways he couldn't yet understand. As he stepped into the hallway, the weight of the case bore down on him. He knew they were in for a tough ride, but he also knew they had no choice. They had to catch this killer before more lives were lost. With the file clutched tightly in his hand, Alex headed toward Sarah's office, ready to dive into a nightmare that had been buried for far too long. Chapter 2. The Connection. Detective Sarah Lawson was not easily rattled, but the look on Alex's face as he entered her office told her that whatever he had found was bad. She had just finished her 3rd cup of coffee for the morning, her mind already spinning with the details of their current case. When Alex handed her the file without a word, she knew it was serious. She flipped through the pages, her eyes narrowing as she took in the gruesome details. The photos, though faded with age, were still disturbing. A gallery of horror that told a story of a killer who reveled in ritual. The white rose on each victim's lap was the most unsettling detail. It was the killer's signature, a macabre flourish that turned each murder into a twisted work of art. "What are we looking at here, Alex?" Sarah asked, her voice calm but with an edge of concern. "The past," he replied, sitting down across from her. "This case, it's happening again." Sarah looked up from the file, her expression hardening. "You're sure? This isn't just some copycat?" Alex shook his head. "The details match too closely. The method, the timing, even the choice of victims. Everything is the same. And it's not just one case. There have been 3 murders in the past month, all of them identical to the ones from 20 years ago." Sarah leaned back in her chair, her mind working through the implications. "If it's the same killer, then we're dealing with someone who's been dormant for 2 decades. That's a long time to stay under the radar." "Exactly," Alex said. "And the question is, why now? What triggered them to start again?" Sarah tapped the edge of the file with her pen, her thoughts racing. "We need to dig into the original case. Find out everything we can about the victims, the investigation, and anyone who might have been a suspect back then. Maybe something or someone from the past has resurfaced. Alex nodded. I was thinking the same thing. But we also need to consider the possibility that the killer isn't working alone. It's possible they had an accomplice, or someone has taken up their mantle. The idea of more than one person being involved made Sarah's stomach turn. We need to move fast. If the killer's on a schedule, there's a good chance they're planning their next move. She stood up, grabbing her coat. Let's go down to the archives and pull everything we have on this case. I want to see every piece of evidence, every interview, every dead end the original investigators hit. There's got to be something in there that will point us in the right direction. As they walked through the precinct, the weight of the situation pressed down on both of them. The atmosphere had shifted. What had started as a grim but manageable case was quickly turning into something much darker. The past wasn't just echoing, it was screaming back to life, and they were the only ones who could stop it. They reached the archives, a sprawling room filled with shelves that stretched to the ceiling, each one packed with boxes of old case files. The air was thick with dust, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glare on the stacks of paper. It was a daunting task, but they had no choice. Somewhere in this sea of forgotten documents lay the answers they needed. Sarah and Alex split up, each taking a different section of the room. They worked in silence, the only sounds the rustle of paper and the occasional creak of the floorboards. Time seemed to slow as they dug through the records, their focus sharpening with each new discovery. Hours passed before Sarah finally found something that made her stop. It was a photograph, buried at the bottom of a box marked miscellaneous. The image showed a group of people standing outside a small building, a bar, judging by the sign above the door. But it wasn't the setting that caught her attention, it was one of the faces in the crowd. She recognized him immediately, an old man who had been lingering around the latest crime scene, watching from the shadows. At the time, she had dismissed him as just another curious bystander, but now, seeing his face in this decades-old photo, her heart began to race. "Alex," she called out, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I think I've found something." Alex hurried over, and as he looked at the photo, his eyes widened. "That's him," he said. "That's the guy from the last scene." Sarah nodded, her mind spinning. "We need to find out who he is and what his connection to this case might be. If he's involved, he could be our only lead to stopping this killer." They had stumbled upon the first real clue in a case that had long been cold, and though they didn't yet know where it would lead, they both understood one thing. The past wasn't just echoing. It was catching up with them, fast. Chapter 3. The Witness. The photograph in Sarah's hand felt heavier than it should have. It wasn't just an image, it was a piece of a puzzle that had been missing for far too long. The man in the photo, with his gaunt face and piercing eyes, was more than just a curious bystander. He was connected to these crimes in a way they hadn't yet fully grasped. "We need to find him," Alex said, his voice urgent. "But where do we start?" Sarah thought for a moment, then snapped her fingers. "The bar. If this photo was taken outside a bar, there's a chance he's a regular. Maybe even someone who's been there for years. We need to go back to the scene, talk to the locals, and see if anyone recognizes him." Alex nodded, already moving toward the door. "We'll take the photo with us. If we're lucky, someone will know where to find him." They drove in silence, the tension in the car thick as they made their way to the location of the last murder. The neighborhood was one of the older parts of the city, with narrow streets lined by decaying buildings and faded storefronts. It was a place where time seemed to stand still, and the past was always just around the corner. As they parked outside the bar, Sarah noticed a few patrons lingering near the entrance, their faces weathered and suspicious. She glanced at Alex, who gave her a nod. They were both thinking the same thing. If the man in the photo was connected to this place, then someone here might know him. They stepped inside, the smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke hitting them immediately. The dim lighting cast long shadows across the room, and the low hum of conversation barely masked the creaking of the old wooden floors. Sarah approached the bartender, a grizzled man in his 50s who eyed her warily as she slid the photograph across the counter. "Ever seen this guy around here?" she asked, keeping her tone casual. The bartender glanced at the photo, then looked up at her with a frown. "Maybe. What's this about?" "He's connected to a case we're working on," Alex said, joining her at the bar. It's important we find him. The bartender's eyes flicked back to the photo, then he gave a slow nod. Yeah, I know him. Name's Walter. Been coming here for as long as I can remember. Keeps to himself mostly, but he's a regular. Do you know where we can find him? Sarah pressed. Walter's got a place not far from here, the bartender said, scribbling an address on a napkin. But I'll tell you, he's not exactly the chatty type. Good luck getting anything out of him. Thanks, Alex said, taking the napkin. He and Sarah exchanged a glance before heading back to the car. They had a lead, but the question remained, what would they find when they confronted Walter? The address led them to a rundown apartment building on the outskirts of the neighborhood. The place looked like it hadn't seen a coat of paint in decades, and the windows were grimy and cracked. As they approached the entrance, Sarah felt a sense of unease creeping over her. This place, like the case they were working, was steeped in the kind of darkness that left stains on the soul. They made their way up a narrow staircase, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the silent hallway. When they reached Walter's door, Alex raised his hand to knock but hesitated, glancing at Sarah. She nodded and he rapped his knuckles against the wood. For a moment there was no response. Then they heard the sound of shuffling footsteps from within. The door creaked open just a crack and a pair of bloodshot eyes peered out at them. Who are you? The voice was hoarse, wary. Walter, we're detectives, Alex said, holding up his badge. We need to ask you some questions about an old case. Walter's eyes flickered with something, fear perhaps, before he opened the door a little wider. I don't know nothing about no old cases. Maybe you do and maybe you don't, Sarah said calmly, stepping closer. But we need to talk, Walter. It's important. Walter hesitated, then sighed and stepped back, allowing them into his apartment. The place was as run down as the rest of the building, with peeling wallpaper and a musty odor that clung to everything. Walter motioned for them to sit on a threadbare couch, while he lowered himself into a worn armchair across from them. What do you want to know? He asked, his voice edged with suspicion. Sarah pulled out the photograph and handed it to him. Do you remember when this was taken? Walter stared at the photo for a long time, his brow furrowing. Yeah, I remember. That was a long time ago. Who are the people in this photo? Alex asked. Walter's eyes flicked to them, then back to the picture. Just some folks from the neighborhood. Most of them are gone now. Gone where? Sarah pressed. Walter shrugged, but his hands trembled slightly as he placed the photo on the table. Dead, moved away, doesn't matter. It's the past, ain't it? Sometimes the past has a way of catching up, Alex said quietly. We think the man who committed those murders 20 years ago is doing it again. And you might know something that could help us stop him. Walter's eyes darkened and he shook his head. I told you I don't know nothing. Walter, Sarah said gently, leaning forward. We're not here to accuse you of anything. We just want to understand what happened back then. If there's something you're afraid to tell us, we can protect you. For a moment, Walter looked like he might say something, but then he closed his mouth and shook his head again. I'm sorry. I can't help you. Alex and Sarah exchanged a look, realizing they weren't going to get anything more out of him. But as they stood to leave, Walter's voice stopped them. Be careful, he muttered, his eyes filled with a haunted fear. Some things are better left buried. Chapter 4. The shadow of the past. The drive back to the precinct was filled with an uneasy silence. Walter's words echoed in Sarah's mind, some things are better left buried. It was clear he knew more than he was letting on, but fear had kept him from speaking. That fear, however, only fueled Sarah's determination to uncover the truth. We're missing something, Alex said finally, breaking the silence. Walter knows more about these murders than he's willing to admit. We just need to figure out how to get through to him. Agreed, Sarah replied, her eyes focused on the road ahead. But I think we need to dig deeper into the original case first. There's something about those murders that's tied to what's happening now. If we can figure out what that connection is, we might be able to get Walter to talk. When they arrived at the precinct, Sarah headed straight for the archives while Alex made a call to get a background check on Walter. As Sarah sifted through the files, she found herself drawn to a particular document. An old newspaper clipping that detailed the final victim in the original string of murders. The headline was chilling: "Killer claims sixth victim, police baffled." The article described a woman named Emily Carter, found murdered in the same manner as the other victims, tied to a chair, her throat slit, and a white rose placed on her lap. But there was one detail that stood out. Emily had been reported missing 2 days before her body was discovered, and during those 2 days she had been seen by multiple witnesses in different parts of the city, acting strangely. Sarah's pulse quickened as she read on. The witnesses described Emily as looking dazed, almost as if she were in a trance. Some even claimed she had spoken of seeing shadows following her. It was a bizarre and unsettling detail that had been dismissed by the original investigators as irrelevant, but now, in light of the recent murders, it took on a new significance. She grabbed the file and hurried back to Alex's desk, where he was finishing up his phone call. "I think I've found something," she said, handing him the article. Alex scanned the page, his expression darkening as he read. "Shadows? What do you think this means?" "I don't know yet," Sarah admitted, "but it's too strange to ignore. And there's something else. This was the last victim. After Emily's murder, the killing stopped." What made the killer go silent for 20 years? Alex leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing in thought. Maybe Emily's death wasn't just another murder. Maybe it was the key to everything. Sarah nodded. "We need to find out more about her. If there's any connection between her and the recent victims, it could lead us to the killer." "I'll start looking into Emily's background," Alex said, already reaching for his computer. "You focus on the recent victims. Let's see if we can find a link." As they worked, the hours slipped away, the quiet hum of the precinct's late-night shift providing a stark contrast to the turmoil of their investigation. Sarah pored over the files of the recent victims, looking for anything that might connect them to Emily or to each other. But no matter how hard she searched, the pieces refused to fit together. Then, just as she was about to give up for the night, she found it, a small, seemingly insignificant detail in the report on the latest victim. It was a note from the medical examiner, mentioning that a small scar had been found on the back of the victim's neck. The same kind of scar had been found on the necks of all the recent victims, and though it had been noted in the reports, it had never been considered relevant to the murders. Sarah's heart raced as she cross-referenced the old case files. Sure enough, the original victims, including Emily Carter, had all been found with identical scars. The scars were small, almost imperceptible, but their presence on every victim couldn't be a coincidence. She printed out the information and brought it to Alex, who was still deep in his research. "Look at this," she said, laying the papers on his desk. Alex's eyes widened as he read the reports. "What the hell? How did we miss this?" "It was easy to overlook," Sarah replied, her mind racing. "But what if these scars are the key? What if the killer wasn't just choosing his victims at random? What if he was marking them? But for what?" Alex asked, his voice tinged with frustration. Sarah shook her head. "I don't know, but I think it's time we pay Walter another visit. He knows something about this, I'm sure of it." As they gathered their things to leave, a sense of urgency gripped them. They were getting closer, but with each new revelation, the case seemed to grow more complex, more dangerous. Whatever dark secrets lay hidden in the past, they were beginning to cast long shadows over the present, and Sarah feared that if they didn't unravel them soon, more lives would be lost. The night was cold and still as they drove back to Walter's apartment. The streets were deserted, the city asleep, but Sarah felt a growing tension in the air, as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. When they arrived at Walter's building, they found the front door ajar, a sign that something was wrong. They exchanged a wary glance before drawing their weapons and entering the building. The silence was unnerving, the only sound their footsteps echoing through the narrow hallway. As they reached Walter's door, they saw that it was slightly open. Alex pushed it wide with the barrel of his gun, and they stepped inside, their senses on high alert. The apartment was dark, the air thick with the scent of decay. And then they saw him, Walter, slumped in his armchair, his lifeless eyes staring into the void. Chapter 5. The Unseen. The sight of Walter's lifeless body sent a chill down Sarah's spine. The white rose on his lap was a stark, terrible confirmation of what she had feared. The killer had been watching them, had anticipated their move, and had struck before they could get the answers they needed. Alex moved cautiously through the room, checking for any signs of an intruder, but it was clear that whoever had done this was long gone. The only evidence left behind was the rose, its petals still fresh, as if mocking their inability to prevent this. "Damn it," Alex muttered, holstering his gun and running a hand through his hair. "We were so close." Sarah felt a surge of frustration and helplessness, but she forced herself to focus. There had to be something here, some clue that would lead them to the killer. Walter might be dead, but he hadn't died without leaving them a message. She approached the armchair, careful not to disturb the scene. Her eyes scanned the room, searching for anything out of place. It was then that she noticed something on the floor beside Walter's chair, a piece of paper partially hidden under the leg of the table. Bending down, she carefully pulled it out, revealing a note written in shaky handwriting. The words were scrawled hastily, as if Walter had known he had little time left. "They're always watching. The shadows, they never leave. Beware the scarred ones. They are marked for him. He's coming for you next." Sarah's heart pounded as she read the note. The mention of the scarred ones sent a jolt of realization through her. The scars on the victims' necks, they weren't just marks. They were signs, signals that these people had been chosen. But by whom? And why? She handed the note to Alex, who read it with a frown. "What does he mean, they're always watching? And who are the shadows?" "I don't know," Sarah replied, her mind racing. "But whoever he is, we're not just dealing with a single killer. There's something bigger going on here, something we don't fully understand yet." Alex's eyes narrowed. "We need to find out who he is. If Walter knew, it's possible someone else does too. Maybe one of the original investigators on the case." Sarah nodded. "I'll start making calls. But first, we need to get the forensics team in here. Maybe they can find something we missed." As they waited for the team to arrive, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was an irrational fear, but after reading Walter's note, it felt all too real. The idea that there were unseen forces at play, shadows that lingered just out of sight, filled her with a deep unease. When the forensics team finally arrived, they worked quickly to document the scene. Sarah and Alex stood back, their minds already moving to the next steps. They couldn't afford to waste any more time. Walter's death had only intensified the urgency of their investigation. As they left the apartment, the weight of the case pressed down on them more heavily than ever. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but the picture they formed was one of horror and confusion. Whoever was behind these murders had been playing a long game, and now it seemed the endgame was near. Back at the precinct, Sarah began reaching out to the old investigators who had worked on the original case. Most of them had retired, but one name stood out, a detective named Martin Tate, who had been the lead investigator before the case had gone cold. She managed to track him down to a small town a few hours away, where he had retired after a long career. "Martin Tate," Alex said as they drove out of the city. "He was one of the best in his day. If anyone knows what's going on, it's him." "I hope so," Sarah replied, staring out the window at the passing scenery, "because right now we're running out of options." They arrived at Martin Tate's house as dusk was falling. The house was a modest, single-story building surrounded by tall trees, with a well-tended garden out front. It was the kind of place where someone would go to escape the world, to live out their days in peace. But as they knocked on the door and waited, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that peace was a luxury they no longer had. When the door opened, they were greeted by a man in his late 60s, with silver hair and a tired, lined face. His eyes, however, were sharp, taking them in with a glance. "You must be the detectives from the city," he said, his voice gravelly from years of cigarette smoke. "I've been expecting you." Sarah and Alex exchanged a glance. "Expecting us?" Alex asked. Martin nodded and stepped aside, motioning for them to enter. "I've been following the news. I knew someone would come eventually. There's something you need to see." They followed him into a small study at the back of the house. The room was cluttered with books, papers, and old case files, but it was the large corkboard on the wall that caught their attention. It was covered with photographs, notes, and newspaper clippings, all connected by strings of red yarn. Martin stood in front of the board, his gaze fixed on it as he spoke. I never stopped working on the case. Even after I retired, I couldn't let it go. There were too many unanswered questions, too many loose ends. What did you find? Sarah asked, her eyes scanning the board. Martin sighed and pointed to a photo in the center of the board, a grainy black and white image of a man with dark eyes and a cold expression. I found him. Or rather, I found his trail. He's been active for a long time, longer than anyone knows. And he's not working alone. Sarah felt a chill as she stared at the photo. Who is he? Martin's eyes met hers, and the look in them sent a shiver down her spine. He's the one who marks them, the one who chooses who lives and who dies. And he's been waiting for something, waiting for the right moment to finish what he started. Alex frowned. But why now? Why did he start again after all these years? Because he's getting stronger, Martin said, his voice low. The shadows are growing and they're hungry. If we don't stop him soon, there won't be anything left to save. The room seemed to close in around them as the weight of Martin's words sank in. The case had taken on a new, terrifying dimension, one that went beyond simple murder. They were up against something dark and ancient, something that had been hiding in the shadows for far too long. Sarah took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. We need to stop him, Martin. Whatever it takes. Martin nodded, his expression grim. Then we have to go back to where it all began. To the place where the first victim was found. That's where he'll be waiting. As they prepared to leave, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. But they had no choice. The past was catching up with them and the shadows were closing in. Chapter 6. The Return. The old, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city was a place that had long been forgotten, swallowed by time and neglect. The first victim had been found here 20 years ago, tied to a chair in the center of the vast, empty space, a white rose delicately placed on her lap. Now, the warehouse stood as a monument to the horrors of the past, a place where shadows lurked in every corner. As Sarah, Alex, and Martin Tate approached the building, the air grew colder, the wind whispering through the broken windows like a warning. The sun had set, casting the world in a deepening twilight that seemed to drain the color from everything. The warehouse loomed ahead, its silhouette dark and foreboding against the fading light. This is where it all started, Martin said quietly, his eyes fixed on the building. And this is where it will end. Sarah tightened her grip on her flashlight, her pulse quickening as they reached the entrance. The door was ajar, creaking softly as it swayed in the wind. She glanced at Alex, who nodded silently, his hand on the grip of his gun. Stay close, Alex whispered, leading the way inside. The interior of the warehouse was as desolate as they had expected. Rusted machinery lay abandoned, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust, undisturbed for years. The only sound was the echo of their footsteps, magnified by the vast emptiness around them. Sarah's heart pounded as they made their way deeper into the warehouse. The darkness seemed to press in on them, and the beam of her flashlight only pierced a small part of it, leaving the rest in shadow. Every instinct screamed at her to turn back, but she knew there was no turning back now. Not when they were so close. There, Martin whispered, pointing ahead. In the center of the warehouse, a single chair stood, identical to the one described in the original case file. It was positioned under a skylight, where a faint beam of moonlight illuminated it. The sight of it sent a wave of nausea through Sarah, but she pushed it down, forcing herself to focus. As they approached the chair, Sarah noticed something on the floor beside it, a small leather-bound book. She knelt down and picked it up, her hands trembling slightly. The cover was worn, the pages yellowed with age, but it was unmistakably a journal. What is it? Alex asked, keeping his eyes on the shadows around them. A journal, Sarah said, flipping through the pages. It looks like it belonged to the first victim. There are entries here, descriptions of strange things she saw before she died. Martin leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he read over her shoulder. It's him. He's been watching her, controlling her. She was marked just like the others. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she read the final entry, written in a hurried, desperate scrawl. I can't escape him. He's in my mind, in my dreams. The shadows, they're alive. I don't have much time. If you're reading this, beware. He's coming for you next. Before Sarah could respond, a sudden noise from behind them made her spin around. The sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse, growing louder, closer. Her flashlight swept across the darkness, but she could see nothing, only the shifting shadows that seemed to dance just out of reach. "Who's there?" Alex called out, his voice firm, though Sarah could hear the tension beneath it. For a moment there was only silence. Then a figure stepped into the faint light, a man tall and gaunt, his face obscured by the shadows. But even in the dim light, Sarah could see his eyes, dark, hollow, and filled with a malevolence that chilled her to the core. "It's him," Martin whispered, his voice trembling. "The one who marks them." The man said nothing, his gaze fixed on Sarah, as if he could see straight into her soul. She felt a cold sweat break out on the back of her neck, her instincts screaming at her to run, to get out of there. But she couldn't move, frozen in place by the intensity of his stare. "Why are you doing this?" Alex demanded, stepping forward, his gun trained on the man. The man's lips curled into a chilling smile, but he remained silent. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small silver object, a scalpel glinting in the dim light. "Stay back," Alex warned, but the man took another step forward, his movements slow, deliberate. Sarah's mind raced, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. This man, whoever he was, had been behind the murders for all these years. He was the one who had marked the victims, who had chosen them, and now he was here, ready to finish what he had started. "Martin, do you know who he is?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know his name," Martin replied, his voice shaking. "But I know what he is. He's not just a man, he's something else, something that's been feeding on fear and death for decades." The man's smile widened as if he had heard Martin's words and found them amusing. He took another step closer, and Sarah finally broke free of her paralysis. She aimed her flashlight at him, trying to get a better look at his face, but the light seemed to bend around him, as if he was a part of the shadows themselves. Alex tightened his grip on his gun, ready to fire, but before he could pull the trigger, the man moved, faster than Sarah thought possible. In an instant, he was upon them, the scalpel flashing in the dim light as he lunged at Alex. A gunshot rang out, deafening in the enclosed space. The man staggered, but the smile never left his face. He raised the scalpel again, his eyes locked on Sarah. But before he could strike, Martin stepped forward, placing himself between Sarah and the man. "It's me you want," he said, his voice steady now. "You've been waiting for me, haven't you?" The man paused, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the two of them stood face to face, and then, with a sudden, horrifying swiftness, the man drove the scalpel into Martin's chest. "Martin, no!" Sarah screamed, but it was too late. Martin fell to his knees, his eyes never leaving the man's as he collapsed to the floor. The man stood over him, the scalpel dripping with blood, his smile fading into a look of cold satisfaction. With a final, desperate effort, Martin reached out and grabbed the man's wrist, his fingers digging into the pale flesh. "You won't win," he gasped, his voice filled with defiance. "We'll stop you." The man's expression remained impassive as he pulled his wrist free, stepping back into the shadows. Sarah rushed to Martin's side, but he was already gone, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. Alex aimed his gun at the darkness where the man had disappeared, but there was nothing there, only the empty warehouse, silent and still. Sarah's heart raced as she cradled Martin's lifeless body, tears streaming down her face. The killer had slipped through their fingers, leaving only death and despair in his wake. But as she looked down at Martin, she noticed something clenched in his hand, a small, folded piece of paper. With trembling fingers, she pried it from his grip and unfolded it. The note was brief, written in Martin's shaky handwriting. "Find the light. It's the only way to stop him." Sarah's mind spun as she tried to make sense of the cryptic message. The light, what did it mean? And how could it stop the killer? As the cold night pressed in around them, Sarah realized that this was far from over. They had uncovered a darkness that went deeper than they had ever imagined, a darkness that had been growing in the shadows for decades. But now they had a new mission. They had to find the light, whatever it was, and use it to end this nightmare once and for all.